Welcome to Ask Andrew, where I answer a film-related question submitted by a member of the BMFI community. This week's question: how has the notion of the leading man changed between classical Hollywood and today? Well, it's changed quite a bit, in part because the sort of conventional notions of masculinity in American culture have changed, and in part because the film industry has changed. The leading man in Hollywood was never um, a single thing. You had uh, the sort of, the romantic lover figures like Rudolph Valentino. You had the strong silent types like Gary Cooper and John Wayne. You had the steadfast, morally upright type like Jimmy Stewart, and you had the suave, smooth operator like Cary Grant. Now, you probably noticed one thing all those men had in common. They were white, and their on-screen personas, if not the actors themselves, were heterosexual. And that uniformity, I think it's fair to say, uh, is not entirely gone, but there's definitely been some diversification of that standard mold. And a lot of that has to do with changes in the industry and changes in culture. But leaving those sorts of identity questions aside, if we're talking about the sort of other elements of the star persona, I think that the kind of the general notion of what a leading man was one that kind of gelled with what quote unquote regular man was supposed to be, the kind of American ideals of masculinity, which was, strong and tough and rational and unemotional and just, not overly sentimental, or at least not overly visibly sentimental or demonstrative in their sentimentality. A problem solver, a rugged individual, a person, a man of action, things like that. They tended to be, more often ruggedly handsome than kind of, uh, more androgynously beautiful, though there were certainly those types. And they tended to be, in the classical Hollywood period, in generally, at the time, what was considered generally good physical shape, but nothing like the sort of ideal physical specimens they would become, either to the ridiculous muscular degree of the 80s figures like Stallone and Schwarzenegger, or even the more modest but still exceptionally fit and chiseled versions that we would often see and see Will Smith depict in some films, or Brad Pitt depict in some films, particularly when they were a little younger. In the middle there, you kind of had in the 1970s a radical departure as to what a leading man was. People like Elliot Gould and Dustin Hoffman and Donald Sutherland were leading men of the 1970s. And those were a very different type of leading man than the typical Hollywood type. Let's leave aside for a moment the fact that some of those figures had a very particular, a specific and identifiable kind of ethnic background. You could also add Al Pacino and Robert De Niro into that that category as well. Something that people like Gary Cooper and John Wayne didn't have. They were also, not known for their physical presence. None of those actors I mentioned in that last batch is particularly tall or striking in their physical presence. In fact, a number of them are quite the opposite. But they were able to give a sense of intellect and emotion and vulnerability and passion, and to show those things, communicate those things at a time, American cinema of the late 60s and 70s into the early 80s, where that was what was in demand, because the type of film that was being made required it. Hollywood moved away from the traditional genres where the leading man could be more of a, I don't want to say stock male figure, but more of a archetypal, I guess, male figure, to the more personal cinema and more artistically driven cinema of the late 60s and 70s, where there was a bit more that was demanded of the leading man, and it was a bit different as well. So there've been a lot of changes. Some of those changes are brought about by changes in the movie going audience. Some of them are brought about by changes in American society. And some of them are brought about by changes in the industry as well. A large part of what makes a leading man, a quote unquote leading man now, is their appeal in countries outside of the United States. And that certainly wasn't the case when you had Jimmy Stewart or Cary Grant or John Wayne. So there are a number of factors that enter into it. And I think one thing we can agree on is that the notion of the movie's leading man has gotten broader. It has diversified in some ways, though there's still a lot more to do. But that the movies are more interesting when there are more different types of people, male, female, what have you, in them. And so while there is a lot to be said for that classic model of the leading man, just like there's a lot to be said for movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the changes that make the movies today different, not all of which, but some of which are very important and very good for our culture, I would say apply to Hollywood's notion of the leading man as well. If you have a film-related question you would like me to try and answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and look for the Ask Andrew form. Who knows? Next time I could be answering your question.